Okay, good evening. In this video we're going to look at writing a rationale in terms of what it needs to do, the purpose for it, and what you need to tick off in order to make sure that you're getting those highest points. Now, I have had a computer bit of a change around, so I think the audio is going to be a little bit windy, unfortunately, but we'll see what we can do about that to fix it up over the next coming weeks. So, a couple of things we want to ask ourselves is, firstly, when we write a rationale, what is the purpose for it? And we need to think about, well, where on our ISMG, on our marking criteria, do we need to tick it off? So let's think about the purpose for the first part. The word rationale in this case means reason. It's an explanation of why you are doing what you are doing. So there needs to be some discussion of the original experiment. So we're after the why. So what did the original experiment find? So for example, if we mention that in an ideal sense, if we were doing projectile motion stuff, we would find that the maximum distance is 45 degrees. But our actual testing didn't show this. Why? Then we would then go into explaining why this happens and then what modifications we do to consider this thing. Or if we were doing the magnesium oxide experiment, you can go, well, why doesn't it have a 1-to-1 ratio of magnesium to oxygen? What about, well, the magnesium reacting with nitrogen in the air, like Mrs. Ganser said? And I can't attest to anything in biology, but again, there should be something, a sort of similar sense that you can get there about you've done an experiment, but there's a bit more complexity going on there. And these give you all options about what your modification could be down the track. But having chosen an experiment to modify and what you're going to modify, now you need to explain why you're doing this modification. That's what the purpose of the rationale is. So link back to the original experiment. After you've done that, you need to expand the theory enough to show that you understand this. So let's duck over the ISMG for a second. The ISMG says that you should have an informed application of understanding of the topic, and your topic will vary depending on what subject you're in at the moment, to modify experimental methodologies. So we need to think about modifying our methodology demonstrated by a considered rationale and justified modification. So we talked about that word considered means earlier. Remember the word considered in this case meaning that you've given attention to detail. And then justified modifications, you've given some reasons for it. So in terms of the rationale, your rationale just needs to go through enough depth So you need enough depth in order to explain why you are needing to make these changes. You might need to talk about the error in the original experiment with the method that the first method that you used, if you're going to refine the method. You may, if you're going to extend it into a different topic, you may wish to talk about, well, this methodology in terms of what it can do, but how can we apply it to a new situation? That would be your considered part about it. But then you would also want to look at, well, what are some limitations about applying this to a new situation? Okay, so it needs to go in enough depth. In physics, this means equations. Okay, and there will be some stuff you'll need to look up. Chemistry, you'd be looking at equations in terms of chemical reactions, and depending on what topic you're actually looking at. In biology, you'd have to consider whatever theory you need to consider for that. The second criteria for your ISMG is justified modifications, and so in this case that you're saying why you're doing this thing. So for example, if I was going to say that, well, I'm going to shoot spherical balls of different mass, and so to do this I'm going to use a ping pong ball and put in different amounts of sand in order to keep the masses approximately, to make the masses different while keeping the surface area and the size of the object roughly the same. This would be a justified modification. Okay, so all you need to do is explain why you got it. you're not going to make these modifications in a vacuum. You're not going to just guessing, I'm going to do this. You're going to have to do some research. Just tell us the research. Okay? Second part of this ISMG, though, is effective and efficient investigation of phenomena associated with the topic, demonstrated by a specific and relevant research question. And that's a really key point. You need to explicitly write your research question, preferably at the end of your rationale. Don't put it at the start, because you haven't explained why you got to it. You should go at the end of the rationale. You're going to go through your rationale and go, all right, well, I'm going to talk about, here's my original experiment, here's the modifications I'm going to do, I'm considering, what factors are influencing it, so here's the modification I'm going to change, bang, here's my research question right at the end. Remember, specific, as we talked about in the previous video, specific in this case means it's clearly defined and identified, and your conditions are detailed, so you're being very clear about into what conditions you're going to do your test on. Remember, you don't want to make your experiment too wide, because then you won't be able to fit it under 2,000 words, and if you don't clarify or just flat out state those specifications, you're losing easy marks. Next part of it is a considered methodology that enables collection of sufficient relevant data. Now, we will talk about that in the method video next, as well as the risks of ethical environment issues, again in the method. So for the rationale, you need to do three things. You need to have a considered rationale. You need to justify your modifications about why you're doing that. And part of that will go in your method, in my opinion, as well. But part of that is going to be demonstrated in your rationale, because you're going to be straight up seeing that, or I'm going to be able to see in terms of reading your assignment, that you are thinking about these things, and then down the track you've made your modification to your methodology, but the justification comes into the rationale. And then finally, your specific and relevant research questions. So if your relevant research question, your specific and relevant research questions read something like, well, let's think about the grade 10 chemistry ones you did last year. To determine the influence on the change of surface area on a antacid tablet under reaction with 1 mole of hydrochloric acid. So I've clearly said the effect of what variables, reaction, I think I said reaction rate and surface area. I've mentioned the specific conditions, it's hydrochloric acid. I mentioned how strong the acid is. Now, to be more specific, say when reacted at room temperature. Okay, or I could say to be reacted at room temperature, recorded, and then in the method say measure the room temperature for today. Okay, and that way I'll be considering you considered methodologies, and so make sure there's a relevant data, because if I was doing a reaction on 2 different days, and if the temperature on one day is 30 degrees on the next day it's 15 degrees, and with how cranky our weather's been lately, there's no reason that couldn't actually happen, that would be a factor to consider. So especially when you're doing chemical reactions, if I was doing air resistant stuff, and we were doing Nerf gun projectile launches, if there was a lot of wind coming into the K-block hallway, there could be an influence on that. We would have to be thinking about a methodology that allows us to make sure our data is relevant, that we can account for any sort of extra variance from things we can't control. But again, these would be things that I would be expecting to see sort of appear in the rationale, as well as in the specific research question. Okay, so make sure with your research question there are details. Okay, ask yourself, is there anything there that I can insert a number that I haven't considered? If I can insert a qualitative or quantitative adjective, I'm going to say qualitative or quantitative descriptors. The more specific you can describe with numbers or descriptive words when needed, the better it will be. If you were to do the magnesium and oxygen reaction again, but instead of doing it with inside a crucible, you did it inside of something else, well, again, that would be a specific thing you'll put into your research question. Okay, so be as considered as possible when writing that, and don't forget these things here. While we're certainly going to ask for a draft reasonably early in the process, you can change it as much as you want. Okay, your hypothesis should be fairly fixed after you've written your hypothesis, but in terms of a research question or in terms of a rationale, you may find that you need to go back and refine this a little bit as you are going through, especially in terms of consideration. So if you're considering variables that you didn't think of, then you can go back and go, oh, maybe I should have talked a bit about this. There's nothing really stopping you from doing that. Okay, so hopefully this video comes out okay. Next one I'm going to look at, we'll be talking about the method, and then we will start looking at analysis and evaluation of data in the coming couple of weeks. Thanks very much, guys. Have a good evening.